Shakky151 brought up an old contradictions in the expanded universe now called Legends that no longer exist in continuity. When proven the stories he brought up was no longer contradicted, he refused to accept it and say it still is. The new Disney canon has contradiction which he does not want to explain, such as Jango Fett isn't a Mandalorian and somehow stole the armor in the Clone Wars series, but in Season 2 of The Mandalorian said that he is Mandalorian, plus other plotline as well. And they still not going to fix it. He pointed out that George did not care about the EU, but he brought up that he was involved with Dark Empire by not wanting the Darth Vader imposter. George was involved with other Star Wars projects like the New Jedi Order series, The Force Unleashed, Darth Bane and Darth Plagueis Species. George Lucas just simply did not have time to read novels. He reads the comic books. He even used expanded universe materials and make reference in his films, which I will show later. Now about George ignore or changing things.
So what? It's George's universe. He's the creator. And he can change whatever he wants to, whenever he wants to. He even changed his own movies with the special editions. Greedo shooting first, anyone? George Lucas even changed a few things the original trilogy established when the prequels came out. Obi-Wan says,
"For over 1,000 generations, the Jedi Knights were the guardians of peace and justice in the Old Republic."
While Palpatine says in Attack of the Clones,
"I will not let this republic that has stood for 1,000 years be split in two."
A generation is a span of many years, not a singular year. And typically a generation is 25 to 30 years long. And 1,000 generations would mean the Republic is more than 1,000 years old.
Now on to how Lucasfilm dealt with the continuity error. Star Wars Insider Issue number 80. The history of the Mandalorians revealed that Boba Fett took on the name Jaster Muriel as an alias. Comic book blood ties wrapped up the novel, The Last One Standing. I am not saying that you should pick up that book and read it. The Return of the Jedi novelization was an early draft, not a final draft. In Jedi Apprentice, The Hidden Past, Obi-Wan had a vision about having a brother named Owen and lived thinking he does. Then he learned it was actually Anakin's brother, Owen Lars. The clones in the Clone Wars that the Republic fought are the Morgokai Shadow Army during the Siege of Saleucami. The Clone Wars that happened 40 years ago was going by Nogri calendar, not the galactic calendar. Even then, if you had read the Thrawn trilogy, Timothy Zahn still kept detail about the Clone Wars quite vague, as George Lucas still wasn't sure if he was going to make the prequel trilogy yet in the early 90s. Even if George ignored or changed a few things, on the other hand, there are a few things he acknowledged in the expanded universe. For example, Lucas literally referenced the EU in Revenge of the Sith multiple times.
Speaking of Revenge of the Sith, when George made the prequel films, he included a plethora of expanded universe references. The major ones I will list here. In Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, we're first introduced to the planet Coruscant. However, it wasn't originally going to be named Coruscant. George's original scripts for Return of the Jedi had the Imperial capital world named Had Abaddon. However, to keep consistency, the name Coruscant was adopted for the Republic's capital, as first named in Heir to the Empire. Double-bladed lightsabers first appeared in the Tales of the Jedi comics in the late 1990s, being wielded by the Sith Lord Exar Kun, and Darth Maul famously wields a double-bladed lightsaber in Phantom Menace. In Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, we see a few Jedi characters in the background of numerous scenes, one of which being the Blue Twi'lek Aayla Secura, who first appeared in the Star Wars Republic comics. This next one's more of an Easter egg. In the Outlander Club, if you look at the TVs in the background, you can see game footage from Star Wars Episode 1 Racer. These next few references from Revenge of the Sith are a bit tricky, as they are mostly tied into the media within the Clone Wars Multimedia Project, a 3-year project to cover the 3 years in between Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, with comics, books, video games, and the original Clone Wars series, to which George Lucas was involved in, as I will explain later. In Revenge of the Sith, after the Battle of Coruscant, Anakin and Obi-Wan are conversing about how many times Anakin has saved him up until this point, to which Obi-Wan replies, 9th time. That business on Cato Nemoidia doesn't count. This is a direct reference to the opening chapters of the New York Times bestseller Labyrinth of Evil by James Luceno. Later in the film, Obi-Wan is filling Anakin in on reports that he missed on the Outer Rim sieges, which he explains, Seleucami has fallen and Master Voss has moved his troops to Boz Pity. This sentence contains 3 EU references simultaneously, the first being a reference to the Battle of Seleucami, first depicted in the Star Wars Republic comics. The next is a reference to Quinlan Voss, a Kifar Jedi also from the Star Wars Republic comics, and Boz Pity, a reference in this case to the last 2 issues of Star Wars Obsession, which depicted the Battle of Boz Pity. Interesting fact about Quinlan Voss, he was one of George's favorite characters from the comics, so much so that when John Ostrander was planning to kill him off at the end of the Republic series, George stepped in and his fate was changed so that he would survive. Though, no canon comics after this series continued his story, save for Star Wars The Clone Wars and an Infinities comic featuring an elderly Quinlan Voss cameo. Later in the film, when Padme is talking to Anakin about the war, she says, "This war represents a failure to listen. We need to stop the fighting and let diplomacy resume." This is an exact verbatim quote from a Jedi named Mira in the comic Star Wars Jedi Mace Windu, released in 2003. Lastly, this is probably just an Easter egg, but I thought it was worth mentioning. During the Order 66 scenes, Plo Koon is flying a Delta 7 Jedi starfighter, painted remarkably similar to Anakin's customized Delta 7 from the original Clone Wars series, as well as the Republic comics.
In Revenge of the Sith, in Palpatine's office, there is an art mural in the background during the scene where Palpatine reveals he's a Sith to Anakin. In the Revenge of the Sith visual dictionary, it confirms that this piece of art is a depiction of a battle of one of the ancient Sith wars between the Jedi and Sith. A wall panel in the office depicts a legendary battle between the Sith and the Jedi. Revenge of the Sith visual dictionary 2005. It's rumored that this was a battle in the Great Hyperspace War, or one of the battles on the planet Rusan during the new Sith Wars period.
You might say that Lucasfilm still had not dealt with the 1,000 generations versus the 1,000 years statement. Palpatine was referring to the Rusan Reformation after the new Sith War. Obi-Wan was talking about the very first incarnation of the Galactic Republic. If you cannot accept the fact that those stories you brought up are no longer contradicted, then you are on the same level of intelligence and stubbornness as flat earthers. And it's like trying to convince them that the Earth is round, and they continue to insist that it's flat even if you take them out into space. If you're still adamant that the stories in the EU legends are retcon, you are had to explain the retcon in the new Disney canon that did not get fixed. But I know you won't. You have no responses and you lost the argument.